Well, with me now is Ben Rhodes, who was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama. Never really got involved in politics, actually, I believe, until Obama 2008. And he's now an MSNBC political contributor. Mr. Rhodes, long time no chat. Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Chuck.
So let's start first with, I'm sure on one hand, you have a lot of ways you would like to backseat drive this administration. On the other hand, I know you don't want to make this whole thing on this, but, and maybe I'm just throwing you a softball here, but what does an American president, what can an American president do that would keep India and Pakistan from suddenly back to talking about a hot war? What does an American president do to keep South Korea and Japan from allowing historical differences to trump what's important now? How does an American president do that?
Well, the fact of the matter, Chuck, is just if the American president was engaged in the normal type of diplomacy and engagement around the world, the defense of democracy and human rights, advocacy for an international system with rules of the road that other nations are following, if we were engaged in that kind of behavior, and India would know that it would face a cost for engaging in something like taking control of Kashmir and rolling in the troops. China would know that it would be under a much greater microscope if the U.S. was going to be organizing not just our own statements, but other countries to express concern along with us. Japan and South Korea would know that the United States would be right in there mediating their disputes. And not only are we not doing that, but the kind of nationalist and authoritarian brand of politics that Trump promotes at home, that's what these leaders are doing abroad. So whether you're Narendra Modi or Xi Jinping, you think that you're a part of a trend that Donald Trump is also a part of.
Now, fill in this sort of, to me, the message gap where you have an exhausted public when it comes to getting involved in overseas conflicts, which then when they hear, hey, we don't want to be the world's policeman, they think, oh, thank God, we're coming home. You know, this is where the nuance, and unfortunately the way our politics works, sometimes nuance is hard to get at. How do you articulate that message of, we don't want more wars, we're not asking for interventions with our military, but involvement matters? How do you find that space?
Well, you know, Chuck, I actually go back to my 2008 experience in politics, and you were covering us at the time. And Obama had two very resonant messages on foreign policy that were not contradictory. One is that he wanted to wind down and end the war in Iraq, and the other is he wanted to restore our standing in the world. Americans might not have followed every issue around the world under the Bush administration, but they knew intuitively that we had lost something. We had lost some respect from other countries. That is even worse today. I think Americans who even aren't following the intricacies of all these issues understand we seem to have a president who is more comfortable with dictators than with our allies. We have a president who will not stand up for democratic values. We have a president who, frankly, is an embarrassment on the world stage. And I actually do think there's a politically resonant message to be delivered that America should stand for something again in the world. We should stand for democracy, that America should be respected in the world. And frankly, you know, I've looked at some of the public opinion polling, Chuck. There are actually soft Trump voters who might align with some of his cultural direction at home, who might align with some of his policies, but are worried that we are losing something in terms of who we are as a country and what we stand for.
I'm curious, I would like to get your reaction to something Kamala Harris said to me on Meet the Press on Sunday about looking at the issue of race through a national security prism. Take a listen.
And they tried out a bunch of different things, and you know what caught heat? The issue of race. So Russia exposed America's Achilles heel. And all of a sudden then, guess what? For those who want to marginalize the conversation about race and racial inequities and say, oh, well, that's identity politics or that's this or that's that, guess what? Now it is also a national security issue. And we need to deal with it.
I find that both compelling and also hard to make a campaign out of.
Well, there are two issues here, Chuck. Very specifically, there's the issue of white nationalist terrorism, which is now, according to the FBI director, perhaps the #1 terrorist threat our country faces. And we saw Trump literally intervene potentially to stop his administration from taking this seriously. That is making us less safe. That is a security argument. But then, Chuck, these people are running for the biggest office in the world. They need to put forward a big vision. And I do agree that they need to be talking more about this. And what they need to do is connect what they're saying at home with what they would stand for abroad. We stand for democracy. That means that there should be voting rights in this country for African Americans, and it means we stand with protesters in Hong Kong who want the right to vote where they live. So essentially, the way in which you can make yourself a bigger figure, the way in which you can transcend these debates back and forth in the primaries about this policy or that, is to offer a vision of how what you're going to do in the United States is connected to what you want to do in the world, and how that is a part of trying to bring about a leadership that, again, is inclusive, that respects democratic values, that, frankly, Chuck, takes the terrain that the Republicans have had since Reagan, that they've tried to own since Reagan, that we stand for human rights, we stand for democracy. The Democrats should be taking that space, and I think there really are important voters who are looking to hear that message.
Let's go down the list of things. If a presidential candidate came to you and said, look, on China, I don't like what the president's doing. I also don't want folks in Iowa to think I'm on China's side. This is one of those where is there enough gray area in our politics where you can successfully side with the president and argue against his mechanics?
Well, here, I'd have a little criticism for the Democrats. I don't think it's right to say, well, we agree with what Trump has done with China, but we have this difference. The fact is, actually, what Democrats should be arguing now is that the economic downturn that is likely coming, and perhaps coming soon, is in large part because of this president's reckless China policy, which, by the way, Chuck, is hurting farmers in Iowa. And those farmers in Iowa know that. I think what you can say is we do need to stand up to China. But the way to stand up to China is not through some kind of reckless trade war. It's by organizing the rest of the world to stand with us.
Ben, do you think that almost is the fundamental hesitance that you have with some of these campaigns? They know I could argue the number one foreign policy challenge is the relationship with China right now because of the impact it's having on the economy. Do you think they're just so fearful of that trade issue?
Well, some of them are, and I think they need to take it on. It doesn't mean that you're a free trader around the world. It's just to say, if we want to stand up to what China's doing to break the rules of international trade, the way we do that is we mobilize the rest of the world in Europe and Asia to stand with us and apply pressure on China.
So would you still be pro-TPP? Do you think Joe Biden made a mistake?
Yeah, I would be, because I think you have to make an argument, essentially, that, and look, you can say, I'm going to, try to get better terms in TPP to get into it, right? So I understand the politics of this. People may want to say, I'm going to get an even better deal. That's normal. That's what Obama did, frankly, on the Korea Free Trade Agreement when he was running for president, and that's what he did as president. But I think we have to make an argument that what Trump is doing is not working. And here's the thing, Chuck, you know this about voters. They understand something about Trump. They understand that he's reckless, and they're kind of nervous about it. And so if you take something that people already believe to be true about the president, he's reckless, and say, look what he's done in China. By being reckless, he could bring about a recession. He could really hurt you. He's already hurting American farmers. American consumers are already paying more. You have to be willing to make those arguments and say, yes, I'll stand up against what they're doing to break the rules on trade. But we're going to do that by getting the whole team together here around the world and once again being a leader.
It sounds like you're tough on the entire field here. You think the entire Democratic field has basically been too hesitant on this topic in particular?
Well, they're going to need a contrast, Chuck, on China. And it's not to say that they can have all the strong language in the world they want about all the bad things China has done. The stealing intellectual property, unfair trade practices, giving Americans a raw deal. That can all be true. But I think that you have to have a different answer than Trump's, especially when what Trump is doing has been so disastrous. And again, I think the way you do that is say, when we want to go up against China, when we want to confront them over what they're doing, we're going to do that with Europe and Asia standing with us so that we have more leverage and that the Chinese are going to have a harder time going tit for tat with us in this trade war.
Ben Rhodes, former national security, deputy national security advisor to President Obama. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for coming on and sharing your views. Appreciate it.
Good to see you, Chuck.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.